Well, it's a great pleasure. Actually, we have Secretary Duncan here, and I know he has to head out, so I want to make a point of having him come up here. Just as a quick introduction, when I ran a nonprofit for Asian American women, we tried to think of different ways to empower women to feel that they could accomplish anything. And we often referred to these women as fierce sisters. Fierce sisters. And that became our motto. So when I think about the secretary, that same word comes to mind, fierce. Fierce when it comes to advocating for better opportunities for our students. Fierce when it comes to being innovative and strategic. And fierce, of course, when it comes to being inspiring and committed to education reform, which he has been for a very, very long time. We all know his bio. I'm not going to go into details, but we'd love for the secretary to come up and give his remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kiran. Can we have a round of applause for Kiran and thank her for all of her leadership? We really appreciate it. And I just want to thank all of you for coming today and welcome you to participate in our Asian Pacific Heritage Month event here. And it's great to see people come together. I'm honored to co-chair this with the Secretary of Commerce, who I think is doing an extraordinary job, Gary Locke. He's a great partner. And I think we have a chance to make a huge difference in students' lives. And Karen's going to be so much because of your leadership. And she's got a pretty interesting background for those that don't know. Went to Spelman College, got a law degree, and has just dedicated her life to sticking up and representing and serving those who historically haven't always had a voice and haven't had those opportunities. So that lifelong passion, I think, gives her just extraordinary credibility, and your leadership is going to make a huge difference going forward. We're lucky to have you. Thank you so much. President Obama signed an executive order on October 14th, 2009, establishing the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and the President's Advisory Commission on AAPIs. Their work will lead to increased participation for the AAPI community in and across the entire federal government. We're honored to be the home of the initiative, and we look forward to working with our colleagues in other departments to increase AAPI access to health, commerce and business, human services, the environment, arts, agriculture, labor and employment, transportation, justice, Veterans Affairs, and economic and community development. And today we're extraordinarily excited. I think this will be a fantastic panel to have three fascinating and smart and committed members of the API community on hand to lead our discussion on dispelling the model minority myth. Kalpen Modai is our moderator, and many of you may know him from his appearances on television, on the television show House. He's a fascinating background, many other achievements. He served on the President's Arts Policy Committee during the campaign, teaching Asian American Studies, Sociology, and Film as an adjunct lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a youth organizer in 26 states during the campaign, and we're so pleased now that he's the Associate Director in the Office of Public Engagement, where he does outreach to the API community and the arts community. And we have two panelists. Rhee, who all of you know is the extraordinary chancellor of the school system here in D.C. Huge progress under her leadership here in D.C., a recent, I think, breakthrough of national significance in terms of how we evaluate and reward great talent. And Michelle, we're so lucky to have you leading all the efforts here in D.C. And the eyes of the nation historically were on D.C. for all the struggles of the public schools. And now the eyes of the nation are looking at the improvement and the trend lines that are extraordinarily encouraging. A lot of hard work ahead of us, but absolutely going the right direction. So Michelle, thank you so much for your leadership and for your courage. And then Dr. Frank Wu, who's a law professor, author, and an innovative thinker. He was recently named Chancellor and Dean of the University of California Hastings College of Law, and he'll start that position this summer. He was previously on the faculty at Howard University for 10 years, and he's authored several books, including Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. And he's co-authored the leading textbook on Asian Americans in the law, and was appointed to the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, and to the congressionally mandated Military Leadership Diversity Commission in 2009. So these are three people of extraordinary passion, great commitment, and we look forward to a wonderful discussion with them. Thanks for all of you coming today, and really enjoyed the conversations we had. Thank you.
don't be shy. Come on up. Speakers?
Thanks, folks. My name's Kalpen Modi. I'm one of the associate directors at the White House Office of Public Engagement. Kiran, thank you for hosting us here, and thanks to Secretary Duncan as well for the warm opening remarks. I think you guys really covered what brought us here today and how the White House initiative on AAPIs was created through executive order. One of the big reasons that the president has prioritized this community, along with many others, is because of his commitment to making sure that no American is living in the shadows, understanding that there are disparities that affect many underserved communities, which brings us to today's topic on dispelling the model minority myth. One of the Department of Education's priorities is to increase support for minority-serving institutions. And a little background on that, as many of you who are part of the process know, is that many of today's colleges and universities are facing a number of challenges, particularly in this economic climate: shrinking endowments, decreasing state appropriations, increasing costs. And so many of America's Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions are feeling that pain a lot more acutely, as tends to happen for underserved communities in times of economic crisis. They do more with a lot less. They enroll higher proportions of low and middle income students, which is why the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act provides $50 million to these institutions in mandatory funding over 10 years. And these are dollars that can be used to renew, reform, expand programs so that these students at these colleges and universities are given every chance to live up to their full potential. So while increased support for, and I love this acronym because it's almost as long as the words that it encompasses, but while increased support for AAPI SIs is a big step towards improving education for AAPI communities, there are a lot of issues related to the community that still need to be addressed, and that can be addressed through increasing awareness and implementation of programs, among which are hopefully the discussion we'll have today. Asian Americans in particular are stereotyped to excel in school and professional life when compared to other members of racial and ethnic minority groups. And this concept of the model minority is a myth that most folks do find problematic. It's misleading. It leads to the opinion that AAPIs disproportionately excel as one homogenous group. And unfortunately, that results in policymakers focusing less attention on their needs and disparities with regard to education. Although a relatively high percentage of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders who are 25 or older do hold a bachelor's degree, when that data is disaggregated for the subgroups, it shows that while some of these communities are doing well as a whole, many of those subgroups face significant educational challenges related to historical and economic circumstances, refugee status, poverty. I'll give you a brief example. If you look at the overall rate of folks who have a bachelor's degree, it's about 25% nationally. But according to the 2000 census, only 13% of Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders have a bachelor's degree, 9% of Cambodian Americans, and 7.5% of Hmong Americans, which brings us to today's conversation. So the Secretary did a great job at introducing everyone. I'm going to come over here, and can you still hear me? Yep. All right. And sort of ask the first question of both our panelists, which is just to share a little bit more about what motivated you to pursue a career in public service, especially in education, and how you overcame any of your challenges leading up to what you both do now.
Well, I think this is an interesting question because for me, I grew up as a Korean American in this country, and as you know, in the Korean culture, education is seen as being incredibly important. The interesting thing, though, is that my parents had absolutely no interest in me going into education. So when I initially told my parents that I was thinking about joining a program called Teach for America that would put me in an inner city school after I graduated from college, they thought that was a monumental waste of my Ivy League degree. And really, it wasn't until I got this job. So I worked for 16 years in public education before I came into this job as chancellor. And the whole time that I was working in that role, they couldn't really figure out what I was doing or why I was doing it. And so, thank you. So one of the things that I think is important is trying to think about how we can shift the perspective that Asian Americans have in this country to encourage more of our young people to go into education, because right now, or at least when I was growing up, it was, become a doctor or a lawyer or an investment banker. There was not a lot of talk about become a teacher or a principal or a school administrator. And one of the things that I think I'm most pleased about the fact that I'm in this position right now is that I've gotten multiple phone calls, emails, letters from young Asian American folks from across the country who say, well, I wanted to go into education, but my parents weren't really encouraging it, and because they've heard about you, now they think it might be okay. So I actually think that that's an important thing as we think about the future of public education in this country, to make sure that all voices are recognized, that we have more Asian American educators in the system.
As someone who failed that older generation miserably myself, I relate to everything you said, and definitely appreciate your leadership on that. Frank, do you have thoughts on that?
Likewise, my mother is still hoping I'll go to medical school. And that actually has a serious point to it, which is, for many of us, our parents or grandparents came seeking freedom and opportunity that they couldn't find in their homelands. And I don't begrudge my parents at all. Without their example, I wouldn't be here today. But the strategies that they had to come to this country and to adjust had to do with pursuing marketable skills. Just to get a green card, you couldn't come here if you were going to try to get a job that there were plenty of people here who wanted. But if you came here as a doctor or an engineer or a physicist, something along those lines, well, the United States, they would welcome you. And so it makes perfect sense that for many of our parents and grandparents, for those who we know and love, who raised us, they're a little bit puzzled. Why in the world would you want to go and do something where you don't make a lot of money, where there isn't a tremendous amount of prestige? And it's in part the message that I have, understanding that the United States is different. Every Asian culture has the equivalent of the Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up is pounded down, right? That's a proverb that encourages conformity, tradition, deference to one's elders. Compare that to the American adage, the saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So here in the United States, you have to stand up and speak out. So in part, the message that I have for you is, as much as we respect our parents and grandparents, sometimes we have to follow a different path.
Well said. This is then a good follow-up to the second one, which is that there is a lack of Asian American and Pacific Islander administrators. So talking about positions or careers that relatively few folks in the community enter, and teachers in K through 12 and higher education. So Michelle, I know that you've used your creative methods to recruit teachers via the New Teacher Project. Can you share some of your ideas on how to increase diversity of the education workforce? And then for both of you, how do we recruit and retain more AAPI administrators in those positions?
Well, when I was running this organization called the New Teacher Project, one of the things that we did was we went out to recruit mid-career professionals, people who did not necessarily get degrees in education to leave their lucrative careers in other spaces to potentially become teachers or administrators in school districts. And by widening the net in that way and not just assuming that everyone who's going to become a teacher is making that decision at age 18 and then going through 4 years of education school, I think is one way to make sure that you can diversify your teaching pool. I think another great example is Teach for America, where that organization, because of the fact that they've been able to create a program that has such an intensive sort of aura of selectivity around it, where now huge percentages of the graduating classes from Ivy League schools are applying to Teach for America. There's a huge sense of kind of, selectivity, that you were chosen for the program. They reject lots of kids every year who are coming from these great colleges and universities. And by virtue of the fact that it has created that aura, I think it's done a remarkable job in terms of interesting people who otherwise wouldn't necessarily have considered a career in education. And I think if you look at their data, what they show is that once people come into the program and have such an intensive experience in a public school system, that the likelihood that they stay in the system and remain an advocate for public education in the long term is very high. So I think we have to think about ways that we can continue to increase the number of opportunities that we have out there, and not sort of keep it narrow to what traditionally has taken place, which is people who are coming through traditional schools of education.
Let me take the second part of the question about leadership roles. And this is a way that we can start talking about the model minority myth. You know, many people say, when we talk about Asian Americans and civil rights, they shrug, they're puzzled. They say, well, what are you talking about? You Asians, you're all doing so well. What kind of problems could you possibly have? You know, people sometimes say to me, would you come over here and help me fix my computer? You Asians, you're so good at that sort of thing. You know, makes me want to go right over and erase their hard drive. Not because I'm mean, but because that's a stereotype, right? And it's hard to explain what's wrong with this, because people say, but that's positive. We're praising you. You're good at math and science. You're hardworking, right? But when you look at the actual data, what you find is not just that many ethnic groups fall behind, and you can document this statistically, you can provide lots of data, but for many people that's just not compelling enough. They don't believe it. But you can also look at leadership roles, and when you look at that, you find that astonishingly, even in higher education and in roles where you think Asians are dominant, in the sciences, in healthcare, when you look at the leadership ranks, there are almost no Asian Americans. And so that's why it's so important for us to not just encourage people, not just encourage Asian Americans, youngsters and their parents to pursue these roles, but to explain in a thoughtful way. You know, we don't want to sound hypersensitive or too PC, but when people have this praise, this compliment, you Asians, you're all so good at this or that, sometimes it's two-sided, right? It conceals a little bit of resentment. Maybe the Asians are a little too hardworking, right? To be hardworking, what is that? It's to be unfair competition. Or to be good at math and science. What's that mean? It's to be good at only math and science, right? You're a nerd, you're a geek, you don't have people skills, you can't lead. And so some of this has to do with breaking down stereotypes so that people understand that Asian Americans are like anyone else. There are smart ones and lazy ones, hardworking ones and stupid ones, and we can do anything, and it's important that people understand that we can express the full range of humanity, that we can be athletes and artists as well as doctors and scientists.
Okay, so I have to tell a story. When I first got to this city about 3 years ago, and the mayor announced that I was his pick for the city's first schools chancellor, there was about 3 days where people were going absolutely nuts. They were thinking, oh my gosh, Adrian Fenty has lost his mind, right? He's hired this little 37-year-old girl, Korean girl from Toledo, Ohio, who has never run a school, much less a school district. And given what terrible condition our schools are in, why would he think that she is the person who's going to solve the problems? And after my first couple of weeks on the job, the deputy mayor of education here in the city, Victor Reynoso, came up to me and he said, you know, you have a real fan out there already. And I said, really, who is it? And he said, it's Mrs. Williams, Anthony Williams, who was the prior mayor. His mother is an enormous fan of yours. And I said, really? Because I haven't met her yet, I don't think. And he said, I know. I asked her about it. And I said, you know, I ran into her at an event. And she said, this was a brilliant move. Michelle Rhee is great. This is the smartest move that Adrian Fenty could have made. And he said, oh, did you meet Michelle? Were you able to talk to her? And she said, no, I don't have to. He said, she's Korean. And everyone knows that if you want someone to come in and fix a really difficult problem, you just have a Korean person, because they work really hard and they're smart and they're stubborn and they don't take no for an answer. And so The only way that you would fix a system like this is to bring a Korean lady in to run it. So I think this is just brilliant. So it was in that time that even though lots of people were sort of looking at me and thinking that race was going to be a negative factor in trying to turn the school district around, that at least some people in the minority anyways sort of thought that this was a big advantage.
That's a great story. I can't top that. I'm glad to give you a lead into that wonderful story.
Well, then let me flip this a little bit and see if you can offer maybe advice for folks who are teachers or are thinking of becoming teachers, some of the high school students maybe. And how did you each successfully make that transition from teaching to more of a leadership role, particularly since both of you are seen as national leaders at this point in your careers? What was helpful? Were there things that you wish you would have done differently or not?
Well, for me, it was really the experience that I had as a classroom teacher that drove my career up until now. And as a teacher, I taught in Baltimore City in one of the lowest performing schools in the entire district. It was a 100% African American population, almost all of the kids on free and reduced lunch. And I had this incredible experience where over a 3-year time period that I was teaching there, in my second and third year, I was able to loop with a group of kids, so I taught them in their second and third grade years. And together with another teacher that I team taught with, we took a group of kids who, when they began second grade with us, they were at the absolute bottom in terms of their academic achievement levels, and within 2 years' time, they went to the absolute top. And it was fascinating to me because during the course of those 2 years, who their parents were didn't change, their environment didn't change, their home lives, the violence in their community, all those things remained the same. What changed were the adults who were in front of them every single day and the expectations that we had of them. And it was because of that experience that I thought, you know what, if we really want to change what's happening in public education today and the outcomes of poor and minority kids, we have to change what's happening inside the classroom and inside the schools. And so it was with that conviction, because what my experience taught me was that the low academic achievement levels of poor and minority kids in this country has absolutely nothing to do with what their abilities and their potential are, and everything to do with the environment that we're creating for them in these schools and what we as the adults either are or are not doing for them. And so it was with that conviction of a lot of people who are sort of in education policy, they throw around these catchphrases, all children can learn and all this sort of stuff. But for me, I actually saw it happen with this group of 60 children. And so that's what has fueled my desire to really make sure that kids across the country in urban environments were getting the best human capital, were getting the best teachers possible. So that's really sort of what drove my trajectory. I don't think it was sort of one thing or another about me being Asian or not. It was really having had that experience of seeing a group of kids move so rapidly along the trajectory when you did the right things for them.
I would say that to be a successful leader, to be a successful leader, you have to have a vision. You have to have a reason, something compelling that motivates you and others to lead. There are those who pursue leadership roles because they want to feel important and want to have that role. As for me, I'd rather be at home, with my dogs. I have sought leadership roles because I've wanted to do something to change the world. And the way that started for me is as a kid growing up in Detroit, not too far away from where you grew up, a few years prior, but not that much. And I'm embarrassed to admit this now, but when I was a kid growing up, I was always sort of ashamed of my own parents. Because they had accents, they ate funny smelling foods. My dad was always trying to get me to eat chicken feet and things like that. And they didn't laugh at the right time when we watched TV, things like that. And so I always knew that it was because of my parents that I was different. And this is in an era before we celebrated diversity, and so everyone was expected to assimilate and be normal. That's what I wanted to do. I never would have said I'm Asian American. I never would have wanted to talk about any of these issues. But what changed for me is in 1982 in Detroit, there was a murder. Someone who I didn't know, but you may have heard this name, Vincent Chin. He was a 27-year-old out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He had a bachelor's party. He's of Chinese descent, a U.S. citizen. His father had fought in the U.S. Army during World War II. He was no saint. He was at a bar, at a strip club in a seedy part of town, and ran into two other gentlemen, auto workers, both white, who were also just out having a good time, drinking a little too much. And they looked over at him and started to use racial slurs. You know, they called him a chink, they called him a Jap, and then they started to use some obscenities, and pardon the language, but I think it's important to share this story. They ended up saying, "You little motherfucker, it's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work." And before the evening was over, using a baseball bat, they had bludgeoned him to death. Now, I didn't know Chin, but I grew up a few miles from where this happened. And when I learned about this, and not just the killing, but they were sentenced to 3 years of probation and a $3,000 fine, this precipitated a nationwide civil rights protest. It was that moment that I realized, wow, there's something going on. It's not just that I get called chink and Jap. Other people do. It's not my fault. It's not in my head. It's not my parents' fault either. And I better do something about this. And that's what led me to ultimately teach at Howard, the nation's leading historically black school, and has motivated me ever since, that particular story. We all have a story like that. Something that makes us do what we do. And we can never lose sight of that, because the frustrations of budgets, of political controversies, and human resources, of just day-to-day management, the grind of leadership, will wear you down and burn you out if you're not leading people someplace better than where you are now.
So, Frank, to go off of that a little bit, in your book, Yellow, you talk about schoolyard bullying and some of your experiences. What would your advice be to some of the AAPI students here, or kind of folks in the community who have had those experiences, who may be victims? I mean, look, you've got modern day situations in places like Philadelphia, here in DC. Post 9/11, there are subgroups in the AAPI communities that deal with this all the time. What would your sort of advice be to students and to maybe school administrators on how to effectively tackle that? And I would pose that to both of you, actually.
I would say we have to take it seriously for two reasons. Here's the first. You know, when I was a kid, I'd go to my teachers and say, you know, this is happening, and they would sort of poo-poo it. Oh, just say, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Right? Well, you know, it's funny, when I think back on this, I was like any other kid. I went flying off the swing sets, broke bones, knocked teeth out. I suffered all sorts of physical trauma, and kids can go through all sorts of things. You drop kids on their head and they bounce back, right? Things that adults can't recover from. So the physical stuff, breaking bones, I've forgotten about all that. That doesn't matter to me. But being called chink or Jap or gook or just all of that stuff, that nonsense, it turns out it's not just a childhood cruelty. For some reason, I don't think it's that I'm especially sensitive, but if I'm walking down the street here and some random kid calls me a chink or Jap or gook, it takes me back 30 plus years to those days on the playground. And that type of psychic trauma lasts with people. And that's why media images are so important. That's why all of this affects how we see ourselves, how we see our own potential. Second reason is, if you look at all these cases, all the hate crimes, whether it's post 9/11 or in New Jersey, the dot busters from the 80s, you know, vicious skinhead gangs that preyed on South Asians and viciously beat them up and in some instances killed people. What you see is the name calling, the bullying, that's just the beginning. And once you start there, not in every instance, but often enough, it's a pattern, and all it takes is a drink, a mob, a little bit of economic uncertainty, the threat of terrorism, something else, and it pushes people over the edge. So the message that I would have is, this stuff is real. It's not trivial. We can't brush it off, and anyone who does is just setting the stage for a hate crime or something far worse.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at, if you watch the news these days, this happens all of the time, where something will happen to a young child, something absolutely catastrophic, and then for 3 days, right, CNN and Wolf Blitzer in the Situation Room will be talking about the bullying of a child because the kid was perceived to be gay or overweight or what have you. And then it sort of dissipates and people move on. And I think that the most important thing as parents, as students, teachers, and other advocates in the community is that you can never allow these things to just sit and not be addressed. Because they will, as Frank said, absolutely bubble up when the perpetrators of the name-calling or the bullying learn their lesson that nothing really happens to you if you do this. Then what does that incite? It incites more of that behavior and probably escalates it even. And a lot of times people do think, well, it's just kids being kids or the heat of the moment. But if you look across the country, across history, I mean, you see where these things escalate to the point of real devastation in people's lives. And you just, as people who are responsible for education of children, at the lowest levels, we have to make sure that we are addressing it. And for those of you who are parents out there, teachers, or other advocates, if you're not getting immediately the answers that you need, then it's your responsibility to take that up the chain of command higher and higher until you get the answers and the responses that you need. Because it's not just oftentimes about you and your individual child, but I guarantee you that bully is doing that to 10 other kids. And so it's your responsibility to actually make sure that you're helping to protect all of the children in that particular school.
So off of that, one of the portions of the narrative around bullying or around school violence is this idea that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to some extent as well are perpetual foreigners. That no matter how long a particular subgroup or community has been here, they're never really American. And for the newer subgroups, many of whom are refugees living in poverty, working class, there are language and cultural barriers that the parents of these students face. From your experiences as educators or administrators, what are some of the ways that you've been able to encourage parents with language or cultural disparities to get and stay involved in their students' education?
So I'm experiencing this firsthand because my children are enrolled in a DCPS school, but they're enrolled in a bilingual school. So they learn Spanish half the day and English half the day. And I don't speak a lick of Spanish. So what this results in is my kids come home and they have homework and I have no idea how to help them. I mean, literally, I'm looking at the thing, I don't understand. I could try to look every single word up in the dictionary, which would take forever. My kids become incredibly frustrated with me. And so my unfortunate but right now viable solution is I call my best friend, who is the Spanish speaker, and I put her on the phone with the kids and they read the thing to her but I mean, what I think it has helped me realize over the course of the last few years is the frustration that our immigrant and non-native English speakers parents have when they're in that situation where they're truly trying to help their children. They just don't have the ability to do it, and then the kids' frustration on the other side of that. And so it's really made me much more aware about the resources that the district offers to families who are in this situation. Trying to make sure that we have homework helplines where kids can call in and they can, ask somebody for homework, where parents are getting information from the schools that are translated ahead of time. So we're proactively doing that instead of them having to come to the school and having to beg for somebody to help them. To staff members who are way too busy and have other things to do, making this a priority and being proactive on the front end to say to our English as a second language families, here's what we're going to do to provide you support so that we are sending the message to them that we want their engagement, that we want their involvement, and that we're going to do whatever we can to support that, instead of the other way around where they're feeling alienated and isolated from the school community because they're not able to engage in the ways that they want to for their kids.
You know, every time I visit China, I realize my mother was right. I should have paid attention in Chinese school. Some of you in this room perhaps were sent to a Saturday language program or some after-school program, and many of you probably felt the way I did as a kid, which is I'd rather be watching cartoons, right? You know, why am I being forced to do this? This is terrible, and so on. Now looking back, I realize the United States is the only nation in the world where you can be considered educated and successful and yet be monolingual. Everywhere else you go, it doesn't matter whether you're in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or Europe, people speak 2, 3, 4, 5 languages, and that is the norm. Indeed, China will be soon the largest English-speaking nation in the world. So we have to adjust to this new reality. And what I would suggest is the answer here is support from policymakers, from schools, from teachers, that doesn't demonize newcomers, but recognizes that, you know, most of them, and their children especially, desperately want to fit in. If you look at English as a second language programs, they have enormous waiting lists. The folks who are coming now, like the folks who came 3 or 4 or 5 generations ago, though different in skin color, are nonetheless people who are drawn to this great American dream that we have. And what we need is school districts and leaders who recognize that and say, you're welcome here, and not just because we're doing you a favor. By coming here and helping and being part of this community, you enhance the education for everyone, just as sending kids to a bilingual program, parents realize now that will give your children a competitive edge in the future. And so it's something that we want to encourage parents to do, but all of this, it can't be done just by one individual or by one family. The success and failure of these kids depends on an entire system, and it depends on our seeing that we share a vision, that we are all stakeholders, that it is not one group against the other, but it's the message of hope that I think this White House has had, and that resonates with people.
I think one other point on this, because you asked about sort of the, what did you say,
perpetual concept of being a foreigner.
Right. I think one of the things that is important not to lose sight of is the fact that we still need to consistently have conversations and dialogues with children about race today. And I think we're actually losing that. I was on a panel not too long ago with a bunch of people for a big television show, and it was interesting. I got in a little fight with John Bon Jovi, of all things. And this man is a very nice man, but we got into a discussion. Thank you. Because he was saying, we were talking about race in American society today, and what he was saying was, you know, my children are growing up in a very different society. We're training them to be colorblind, and so they don't see, different races, and so what he was saying was, I think when my kids grow up, it'll be a very different racial dynamic than it is in America today. And so Tom Brokaw, who was moderating the panel, said, Chancellor Rhee, do you feel the same way? And it was interesting because that morning I had just had this conversation with my daughter, and so I relayed it to folks. She was 10 years old at the time, and she said to me, I got an invitation from a girl in my class inviting everyone to an Asian birthday party. She's like, what's that all about? Is it going to be a bunch of white girls sitting around eating with chopsticks? And she was very sort of offended by it and very conscious of what this meant in her life. And a couple weeks prior to that, I'd actually had a conversation with a couple of kids who were students in the district who had done an analysis over the course of the summer of all of the AP offerings in our school district and where these AP offerings happened. And what they showed is that a lot of them were actually given at Wilson High School, which is west of the park in the wealthier part of town. And if you went east of the river to Anacostia, there were almost no AP offerings. So they came to me and they said, well, why is this? Is this because we're black? Is it because we're poor? Is it because nobody thinks we can do it? So for children growing up in America today, Race is very much on their minds, and it is something I think that we have to have dialogues with them about. And I think that to the extent that people start to think, well, race is not an issue because racism doesn't exist today in the same way that it did, in the 50s or 60s, it's actually not helping the process at all, because the bottom line is people are not colorblind. You know who's African American, who's Asian American, and kids, regardless of sort of where they come from and what their orientation is, they see those things. And so I think the more important thing to teach children is not don't look at race, because actually race is a part of who all of us are. It's a part of our experiences, and that's a positive thing. What we have to teach kids is how you should not make assumptions or be prejudiced against people based on what their race is, about what their abilities are, what their likes and dislikes are, et cetera. And I think that's a slightly different thing, and we actually have to move away from, we want to move into a colorblind society, which I don't think is the right thing to do, to sort of an education of the next generation of kids about the role that race either does or doesn't play in society.
May I follow up? I think that's a great comment, because race is now much more complex. It's complex because we've been successful in showing people and persuading people, whatever their ethnic background, whatever part of the country, whatever party they belong to, bigotry, open, outright, in-your-face, hardcore bigotry is condemned almost by everyone. There's still some fringe outliers out there, but they're extremists. But what that means is, for many people, they think it's all done. That all race and racism is about is the hardcore, extreme fringe part. It's not about the subtle, the structural, the stuff that passes almost without comment. So the challenge now is not to persuade people that bigotry is wrong. The challenge is to persuade them that race still matters. Let me give you two real quick ways that we can see this. One is with kids. So this still happens to me, not every day, but often enough that it makes me realize there's something going on. It's all about race. I'll be walking down the street here in our nation's capital, and some kid coming the other way on the sidewalk, I don't know, 7 years old, 8 years old, some boy, as he comes toward me, he's a stranger to me, I'm a stranger to him, he spots me there in the crowd, he stops, he smiles, and he strikes a pose, a karate, kung fu, martial arts pose, right? He wants to have a fight right there on the sidewalk. It's just a big joke, right? He kind of kicks or punches at the air and laughing. He turns around and runs away. Now, I could chase the kid down the sidewalk and collar him and say, you're a bigot, but I wouldn't do that. There's no question, though, it's about race. Why? Because he doesn't go up to everyone. He only does it if you have this color skin, this texture of hair, and this shape of eyes. Even if I'm wearing a suit and coat and tie, he thinks I've got a black belt on underneath, right? And that's just a subtle little signal, because this is not an act of malice. It's not about hatred. This is trivial. He doesn't have any idea how traumatic it was for me when I was his age not that long ago. What it means is, in the back of his head somewhere, there are these racial images. It's the same thing that causes people to say, where are you really from? My, you speak English so well, to which I always want to say, gee, thanks, so do you. All right, second, really quick example. You said, we always notice people's race. I think you're absolutely right. And I'll bet even those of us who think of ourselves as really into civil rights, we're sensitive, we do diversity things, we come to this, right? If you encounter someone who's racially ambiguous, you don't know their racial background, it bothers you, right? You go home after that cocktail party, you say to your wife or partner, hey, Joe's new girlfriend, what was she anyway? You may have chatted with her for an hour, but in the back of your head, you're just trying to figure it out. Is it 50% this, 25% that, right? There's something about that that it troubles us. We want to put people into categories. It's a human tendency. And I offer these two almost trivial, laughable examples to suggest we can't just walk around saying we're colorblind. We can say that, but it doesn't produce the positive outcome.
How are we on time? Sure, yeah. So I guess we have time for a couple questions before we wrap it up. I know some of the students might have had something. Any of the administrators? No one?
It's a rare opportunity, right?
Hi, this is I'm Jorge Ponce, co-chair of the Council of Federal EEO and Civil Rights Executives. We brought Frank in the past to the Department of Commerce. Great speech, and Michelle, enjoy your comments as well. My question is, trying to motivate the young AAPI in school and in the workforce. You know, you look at the Department of Education and the Bureau of Census Statistics, and you see that the majority of the AAPI population exceeds the educational skill set of the majority group of the population, whites. And yet, when you go to the federal bureaucracy and you look at the leadership level, which is the SES, the Senior Executive Service, you would think that considering that they are better educated than their white counterparts, that they will be better represented at the senior ranks, and that is not happening. I know that the keynote speaker at the Department of Commerce next week is Jane Hung, who's written the book Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, and we've asked her to address this issue. But I think that, you know, I know that Frank has written extensively. I've read his book, Yellow. How do we get past? Because I think it's a breach of contract that we're telling AAPI kids to excel in school, and they do. And the statistics show that. And yet, when it comes time to putting them in positions where decisions are made and budgets are approved, we breach the contract.
So on a federal government side, I can kind of just touch on this with regard to the initiative, and then I'll defer to both of you. That's something that we're taking very seriously. It's one of the reasons why the president reestablished the White House initiative on AAPIs. And the number one thing I think that the initiative is going to be looking at, if I can put you on the spot, Kiran, is this misconception that has to do with aggregation of data. So one of the reasons that it seems like Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders across the board are so highly excelled compared to Caucasian Americans, right, or other groups, is because these 35 plus different subgroups are viewed as one, which means that while, you know, undeniably, you know, Indian Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, whose parents immigrated to the U.S. in the post-65 but pre-1980s era of that immigrant group might excel, there are a vast number of others who might even share that same ethnicity, same ethnic group that have come post-1980s, who are largely working class, largely undereducated. And that doesn't even take into account other subgroups who might have come under different immigration circumstances. And that's something that the initiative is looking at, so that you can figure out, once you disaggregate that data and once you tackle that, you can hopefully identify the pipeline for how to actually fix the gap at the top as well. But how do you folks feel about that on the level you've been working at?
Well, from a personal perspective, as I said earlier, you know, I experienced a little bit of this when I first got here. So people saying, well, how could an Asian American woman possibly come into this role? You need to be tough, you know, you need to be able to do all these things. And I think the sort of stereotype of a typical Asian woman was sort of, you know, it's fresh in people's minds. I think I have probably successfully showed that
You're tough.
that is not the case. In fact, I don't know that. I think people might, you know, sort of think, oh my gosh, an Asian American woman. Let's stay away from that now. But I think that this is, you know, one of those things that has to sort of happen to a certain extent gradually over time. You have to have experiences with people that actually shatter or violate the stereotypes that individuals have in order for it to sort of become more sort of commonplace or more accepted. And I think that once you see that happen more and more, then you're sort of gonna get on a different trajectory. But I think that you know, this is still the case to a large extent to women overall, not just women of color. But you know, if you look at when people write about me, they often say, with her, you know, high heels clicking on the ground and sort of slim black pants and blah blah blah. Like, if I was a 50-year-old white guy, you would not be talking about what my shoes or pants look like. I can guarantee you that. you'd be talking about a whole lot of other things. And so, I think it comes to the need to actually point out the fact that these are still significant issues in society, that we are not in any way over sexism or racism in this country, that it still actually plagues us in a lot of more subtle ways today, but to the extent that those things are not called out and that we don't call, whether it's the media or other people, on those things, I think that they continue on.
I would say there are internal factors and external ones, and even if you look at the groups that are doing the best, they're concentrated at the entry level. So you don't find very many Asian Americans of any background in SES or senior presidential appointment, Senate confirmed slots. Some, and this White House has done just an amazing job, but if you look at the SES ranks, it's really, you can count them on one hand. The people you meet who are Asian American who hold those senior civil servant jobs, typically you remember who they are because they're so identifiable. They're the one and only. The internal factor is, I think, Asian Americans, we have to overcome some of these different cultural backgrounds that we come with. You know, every stereotype does have a germ of truth, often exaggerated and distorted, and many Asian Americans live up to or down to the stereotype. And we have to encourage Asian Americans to be louder. You know, whenever I do a talk, because people know I'm a lawyer, someone will come up to me afterward who's of Asian descent. They'll tell me this entire story about the glass ceiling, how they've been held back, people have been promoted over them, they have a PhD, the other people have master's degrees, they've got documents, and, you know, they've been called names, and I say, you ought to hire a lawyer. And they say, oh, no, I couldn't do that. That's not in my culture. It would embarrass my boss. And I want to say, what are you talking about? Your boss is a bigot. Of course you want to embarrass your boss, right? You know. So some of this is we've got to get Asian Americans riled up and, you know, active in a way that others have been, that we just haven't been. When's the last time you saw an Asian American civil rights protest, right? It doesn't happen often. And sometimes Asian Americans have exactly the opposite instinct that other minorities do. An Asian American gets in trouble, oh, you instantly distance yourself. Oh, I don't know him. Same last name, but, you know, Wu, very common. You know, there are millions of us. Don't know anything about that guy, right? Instead of rallying to support the person. So that's the internal cause. The external cause is that people see us as nerds and geeks, as, yes, whiz kid rocket scientists can do calculus in your head, or, you know, played the violin at Carnegie Hall at 3 or the piano at 5, or maybe the violin and piano simultaneously, you know, at the age of 7. But they don't see us doing the sorts of things that leaders do, connecting with human beings. So let me mention our moderator, Mr. Modi's fine work on the big screen. I think it's important that we see Asian Americans who are funny, for example. Why? Because people who are good leaders, who connect with other people, are funny, right? They're not just people who do math and science all the time. And so we've got to see Asian Americans doing that sort of thing, doing the sorts of things that other people do, not just this narrow range of roles. So we need to address both the internal and external factors.
And
that's your cue to be funny.
well, I'm only funny when other people write good lines for me. Otherwise, I have nothing to say. But I think you're right, and I think that you know, I get this question a lot when folks ask about lack of diversity in the arts, particularly the commercial arts, and part of it certainly is a very hard glass ceiling that exists, but some of it is also that the community doesn't support fellow artists from the AAPI sort of internally, right? So I'm glad that you brought that up. How many? No more time? Okay, so we have no time left for any more questions. Sorry, we're a bunch of talkers up here. I would just like to thank both of our panelists for coming out today. Please give them a big round of applause. They do a phenomenal job as public servants every day. Kiran, thank you, and Secretary Duncan for having us, and thanks so much, folks.